video, I'm going to show you how to make this absolutely gorgeous 4-inch diameter model rocket nose cone. I brought this outside so you can see just how shiny this is. It has a glass-like finish on it. It fits beautifully onto a 4-inch cardboard shipping tube for your model rocket. And on the inside, we have an eye bolt for our parachute recovery cord. It's pretty easy to make, so let's get started. First, let's take a look at the soda bottle. Now, this is a standard 2-liter soda bottle. We're interested in the top part here. If you look at some different brands of soda bottles, you'll see that there's a couple of different styles of tops here. There's some that this is very dome shaped. There's others where it has very straight angled sides. And then this particular one has kind of a gentle curve to it. I've used a couple of different ones. This is the one we're going to start with today. As you can see, we only need the top section. So what I did is I took off the label, and on this particular one it was real handy because the manufacturer has put in some little slots or grooves around the bottle. So that makes it really easy to be able to trace a line and cut that out. So all I did was I took a marker and I gently went around in that groove, the first one down, and made a line. Then I was able to take that over to my bandsaw and cut it out exactly on that line. Now if you don't have a bandsaw, scissors work fine for this. Just cut off the bottle a little bit below the line so you get rid of most of it, and then make a nice even cut along that line. It's actually not really super critical that you get that line exactly perfect, because a section of this is actually going to get cut off later. But for trying to align this onto our alignment jig, having a nice straight cut on there is a little bit helpful. So the reason this particular design works really well for a 4-inch rocket, this is a 4-inch cardboard shipping tube. This is what I use for my rockets. It's readily available at office supply stores. You can get it typically off the shelf at 2-inch, 3-inch, and 4-inch diameters. There's probably other diameters available, but that's what's available to me. And that is an inside dimension, so it's 4 inches inside. Now, the key here as far as using the soda bottle as a mold, the 2-liter soda bottle is just a tiny bit bigger than that 4-inch diameter piece of tubing. So that's the key. Now there's 1-liter bottles, and there's also the single serving bottles, like a 12-ounce bottle of soda, but you'll find that they don't fit properly on either a 2-inch or a 3-inch piece of cardboard tubing. So the one that actually matches up is a 2-liter bottle to a 4-inch piece of tubing. For the alignment jig tool, I've taken a piece of 3/4-inch MDF, and I just used a 4-inch hole saw to drill out a 4-inch round piece. And then this is a piece of 3/4-inch dowel. So I drilled a hole through the center and set that in. Now when I set that in, it's glued in with some epoxy, but I also put a right angle piece here and a right angle piece here while that's set up, to make sure that this is nice and straight in both directions in the piece of MDF. I've taken that 4-inch body tube material and I cut off 2 pieces 2 inches long. Now the second one, we're going to use that a little bit later. This first one, I've done a couple things to it. First off, I drew a line right through the center. The easiest way to do that is to take something that's 1 inch thick, and this is 2 pieces of 1/2-inch MDF. I simply clamp those down to the table, and then I can use a pencil or a pen, hold that against the edge, and just rotate the piece around, and that'll give me a line exactly straight through the center of that. The other thing I did is I drilled a couple of little 3/16-inch holes. I drilled 4 of them around the perimeter, kind of close to the top at one end. That's going to be to help the Bondo that we're going to use later to get a nice little grip on this piece and hold it in well. Now we want to get these two pieces glued together temporarily with some hot melt glue. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the cardboard tube piece with the holes up. We're going to set that down onto our centering tool, and then we've got the top of our soda bottle gets set down over that. Now the reason that we wanted to make a nice cut on the soda bottle and a nice straight line on the cardboard is that that's going to help us line that up when we want to glue them together. So we're going to put a couple of dabs of hot melt glue on the cardboard, 3 or 4 in a couple little areas, slide this down, and we've got a little bit of time while that hot melt glue is getting hard. We want to look around, make sure that we're nice and even along that line, and also we've got a little bit of play here on the neck. We want to get that centered up. We just need to eyeball that and get it centered up while that line is nice and straight across the bottom as well. So I put 4 little dabs of glue around the edge of that, and I'm just going to push the soda bottle down just until it gets down to that line, and make sure that we're nice and centered on the top here as well, and just hold that for a minute until that glue hardens up. Once that glue is hard, you can just take the whole assembly off of the centering jig, and then you're done with that part. And that's what you're left with. Now we don't have to worry right now about the fact that there's little pieces of glue sticking out. That'll all get taken off later anyways. Now we're going to need some automotive body filler, also commonly known as Bondo. Now there's basically 4 types of this product. This is the standard body filler product. That's the one I'm going to be using. There's a couple of other types. There's a lightweight version of it, which may very well work good for this project, but I just haven't used that particular style. And then there's also 2 types that have fiberglass in the mix as well. One with small strands of fiberglass and one with big chunks of fiberglass. And that's for reinforcing. We don't need any extra strength on this as far as the fiberglass, and we don't really want any fiberglass fibers to be getting in our way or kind of just messing up with our nice smooth finish on this. So it's best just to use the straight body filler without anything added into it. We'll get a better finish. So follow the instructions on the can for mixing the material with the hardener. I'm going to do this in a couple of steps because I just want to take my time. The first thing I want to do is fill in the cap area, but I want to put some of it in from the bottom and then push it up. And what I'm trying to do is make sure that we fill that good without getting an air bubble stuck in there. It's very easy to get a bubble stuck in the bottom here as you're pushing the material up. And then when you trim that off to a point, you might run into that air bubble later. And if you do, that's okay. You can fill it in later. But if we can get a nice solid fill there, and we're not going to have to worry about that later. So I'm just going to use the rest of what I got and fill in that little area there. And then we'll move on to lining the sides of it. I've got that little bottom area of the bottle filled up. I've just got it on a little paper towel just so it doesn't stick to my table. We'll just tear that off later. I'm going to give this a good amount of time to harden up. I don't need that to be solid, but I don't want it to be runny when I move on to the next step. So give that about a half an hour and check it, and if it seems to be hardening up, we can move on to the next step. Alright, so now that that's hardened up on the bottom there, we'll move on to the next part. I've mixed up a little bit more of the Bondo. I'm just going to lay it in there And the reason I don't mix up enough to try and do this whole thing in one big batch is I really just want time to take plenty of time to make sure that I've got a nice layer of Bondo in there, laid out nicely, and that we don't have any air bubbles like you might see along the outside here, where you can just go in and just push that up against the sides to get all those air bubbles out. So I'm just going to spread this. This will be enough to probably get about halfway up the wall here. We're not filling this in. We just want a nice layer, probably somewhere around, oh, maybe a quarter of an inch, maybe 3/16 of an inch thick. It really doesn't need to be all that extremely thick in here. But we just want a nice layer. It doesn't matter so much what it looks like on the inside, but more what it looks like on the outside. We just want to make sure that we don't get any air bubbles trapped against the plastic, and work all those out. I've got that nicely coated in there. Don't really see any significant air bubbles along the outside here. So we're going to let that set up, and again, once that just starts to set up, and it doesn't have to be extremely hard, but it just needs to start setting up a little bit so that we can't disturb it, we'll go ahead and mix up one more batch, and that should finish this off. So I've mixed up a third batch of the body filler. We're just getting that in there now, and there's a couple things that are a little bit different about this last batch. And you'll notice that there's a little gap between the soda bottle and the cardboard. Sometimes it's a little bit bigger in some areas. You don't need to get that area filled in between the cardboard and the plastic here. You just need to get up to the cardboard and then overlap inside of the cardboard. We're going to sand that off, so it really doesn't matter that there's a gap in between there. And actually, even if we filled it up, it wouldn't make any difference because we would sand it all off later, so we really don't want to get any in there. And then on the inside, we just want to come up onto the cardboard, and what we're trying to do is just get a little bit of the Bondo to go into those 4 little holes, just to help the Bondo grab onto the cardboard a little bit better so that we get a good bond there. And we don't want to come up very far onto this cardboard, because later on we're going to have another sleeve that's going to go in here, and we don't want big chunks of Bondo in our way. So we're just going to come just a little bit over those holes, which are way up towards the top of the cardboard. So we're just going to come down maybe about a quarter to half an inch tops onto the cardboard inside, and that's all we need to do for coverage inside there. But again, more importantly right now is we want to make sure that we don't have any air bubbles along the outside here. So that's, again, the most critical part. So I've got it all spread out on the inside. I've just come up over the cardboard just a little bit. If you get a little bit of Bondo that comes up on the cardboard a little too far, now would be the time just to clean up that area so that you don't have anything in your way when we go to put in the cardboard liner that goes in here. So just clean that area up so that you don't have any excess in there. The outside looks real good as far as not having any air bubbles, and we're going to let this sit for several hours. We want that body filler to be completely hard before we move on to the next step. So you don't want to rush this next part. Let it sit for several hours until that Bondo is completely hardened up. It's been a couple of hours and that body filler is hardened up nicely. Now, the first thing I want to do is cut off this thick part of the bottleneck. Now I don't want to cut in too far because I want to have enough material still left up there to sand a nice point onto the nose cone. but I do need to get rid of that thick section of the bottleneck. So I'm going to take that over to the bandsaw and just make a couple of cuts to get rid of that. Now that that's cut off, the rest of the plastic that's left on here is just thin plastic. So I'm going to use a razor knife just to carefully make some cuts up the side here where I can grab onto this and peel the plastic in little strips off of the body filler. And if some of it sticks to the body filler, that's okay. Just don't fight with those areas. I'll show you a little trick in just a minute on how to get the areas off that stick. Now I was able to get the plastic off of the bottom here, and then you see in some areas I got a little bit up onto here. But for the most part, most of it's stuck on there pretty good. And you can also go around and carefully peel off the little bits of hot melt glue that are stuck on there as well. Now as far as getting the rest of this off, you can either use a blowtorch or you can use a gas stove. But if you just hit the plastic gently with some heat, you'll see that it'll just curl up. And you'll be able to grab onto some more of that. And again, using a razor knife, I'm just going to cut and I'll be able to peel a section off. And then I'll hit another area with the torch, it'll peel up, and I can keep peeling. And you just keep going until all that's gone. And after applying heat all the way around, I was able to just simply peel off the rest of the plastic. And that's what you're left with. Now what I'm going to do is take this over to the belt sander, and I'm just going to sand a nice tip onto this that matches the slope of what's already going on here with the mold. And then I'm going to use the same belt sander and sand around this edge. And you can see here that the body filler is a little bit bigger in diameter than my cardboard tube. And what I need to do is get down to the diameter of the cardboard tube. So I'm just going to sand the body filler just until it reaches the cardboard tube diameter. And here I have my final shape. I've got a nice tip on there and sanded around the edge. And you can tell when you've sanded enough around the edge because you can see, I can see the cardboard tube, or the top of the cardboard tube, all the way around now. There's no more of the body filler that comes down around the tube. So once you get that line completely all the way around, you know you've got it perfectly flush all the way around. Now you'll see that there's some little pockets, some little air pockets and divots in the Bondo. If they're really super small, which some of these are, you don't have to do anything about them. They'll get filled in later on the later step when we put some epoxy on this. But the larger ones, I do see a bunch up here where I think they would benefit from being filled in. So you can either mix up some two-part epoxy and fill those in and sand them down, but I find it's actually easier to mix up a little bit of the Bondo material and push that into those holes and then come back and then just hand sand that to get rid of the excess. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I've mixed up just a really small amount of the body filler to help fill in those holes. And it should be noted that once you fill these in, you do need to let this sit probably again for a couple of hours to let that completely harden up before you attempt to hit those with sandpaper. So I've sanded down the patched areas, and that's the final profile. Now I've got one more step I'm going to do to this before I paint it. And if you don't do this step, it's going to come out bad. So on the cardboard here, there's some areas where the top layer of the cardboard's been damaged, either because we sanded it down or some areas where we tore off the little pieces of hot melt glue. So we've damaged the top covering of the cardboard. If you paint this, what's going to happen is those little cardboard fibers are going to stand straight up, and this will be extremely rough around the outside. it will not be a smooth nose cone at the cardboard areas where the cardboard has been damaged. To seal that down, I'm just going to take some regular white glue and I'm just going to put a thin layer on the cardboard itself, and just using my finger I'm just going to run that around, and I'm just going to put the absolute thinnest layer that I can get on there and completely seal that cardboard. I've used wood glue for this as well, but I find that wood glue, when you try to lay it out really thin like that, it tends to dry very quickly. The white glue gives you a little bit more working time. So I've just got the thinnest layer of glue around the entire piece of cardboard. It's so thin you really can't even see it. You can only tell it's there because it's a little bit glossy. I'm going to go ahead and let that dry for a little while before I go to the next step. Next, we want to build the bottom section of the nose cone where the parachute recovery cord will get attached to an eye bolt. Now, I've got here the ring that we had from earlier, the 2-inch piece of body tube material that we cut out and set aside. And then I've also cut out a piece of 1/8 inch thick MDF paneling material. And that was just basically, you take this, lay it on, trace out your circle, and then cut that out and sand it until you have a piece that fits very nicely into the tube. Next, I'm just going to mark the center of this and drill a hole and attach my eye bolt. I've used a nylon insert nut on the inside of the eye bolt area because when this is all glued together, you won't ever be able to get back to tighten this up. So we want to be really sure this doesn't loosen up on us. Next, I'm going to cut a piece out of this 2-inch piece of body tube material. And what I'm going to do is take it over to the bandsaw, and I'm going to push it against the blade this way, and I'm simply going to cut straight through it. And then I'll rotate around about 1/2 inch and do the same thing. So I'll end up cutting out a section of the tubing about 1/2 inch wide. That will allow me to push this together and make a smaller ring. And what I need is a ring that fits into the bottom of the nose cone piece here. And it doesn't matter if when we put it in there it opens back up and there's a little gap between these two pieces. That's okay. It can be a tight fit or there can be a little bit of a gap as long as it fits in nicely. And here's the little piece that I cut out. It's about 5/8 of an inch. And we see that we can shrink this down and it goes nicely into the bottom of our nose cone. I do have a gap, so if I had cut out about 1/2 inch, it still would have fit just fine as well, but that's okay. Now, similar to the other piece where we made the marking line all the way around the tube, I'm going to do the same thing on this. I'll use the same method. I've got 2 pieces of 1/2 inch MDF, so that equals 1 inch total. I'm going to clamp that down to the edge of my table and then hold a pencil next to that and simply rotate this cardboard piece around to get a line at the 1 inch mark, which is right in the center of this piece. Next, I'll just check the fit to make sure everything fits good into here. Now, again, we cleaned up in here when we did the body filler to make sure that we didn't have any chunks of body filler along the inside of this cardboard tube. So if we just simply put this base piece in and then we slide this other cardboard tube up just till we get to the line, we should be able to pull this back and see that everything lines up nicely. We've got right up against the line all the way around, and this comes up against the bottom of that all the way around on the inside. What we've got to do is mix up some 5-minute epoxy. I'm going to put a ring of epoxy around the inside here, dab a little bit on the outside of this as well, and just slide that in place. And I'll push it up just about where it's supposed to be, about 1 inch in. And then I'm going to take the epoxy and coat 1/2 of this ring just below the line and put that in place and get it lined up all the way around just to the edge of that line, so it's perfectly even all the way around. And then also, before that sets up, we want to pull this piece back so that it's resting against this piece here, so we don't have any gap in around here, and that whole thing is going to dry and harden up all together. So work a little bit fast because you do have a lot to do here. And also make sure you mix up a little bit more epoxy than you think you're going to need, because you're really not going to have any time here to mix up another batch if this starts setting up on you and you didn't have enough. When you're putting the epoxy on the cardboard, you really just want a thin coating. If you put too much, it's just going to all squeeze out when you're putting it together, so just a real thin coat. And when you put that together, if there's any excess epoxy that gets pushed out along this edge, we don't want any lumps of epoxy in that area, so just go ahead and clean off that edge so you have a nice edge in there. Make sure that you're even across the gap here and that you're even all the way across that line. You also want to make sure that this piece of MDF is pulled up and right up against that cardboard all the way along the inside. And then go ahead and let that set for a little while until that hardens. Now it's ready for paint. Now I don't want to get any paint on this bottom 1 inch section because I don't want to affect how it fits into the rocket. So I'm going to take masking tape and just tape off that section before I start painting it. It's not necessary to use primer, but I am going to put a coat of primer on first and then give it a good coat of paint. Alright, so with the paint on, you could technically stop there. It is fully functional at that point. But I am going to go one more step here and put a coat of 2-part epoxy resin on here. Now I've talked about this epoxy on another video, but I want to mention again, there's basically 2 types of epoxy resin. This tabletop or hobbycraft epoxy is a 2-part, and it typically uses a 50-50 mixture, half of the resin and half of a curing agent. That's the stuff I'm going to use. It takes about 12 hours to set up, and even longer than that for it to actually get fully hard. The other type of epoxy resin is typically an automotive style where you mix up a certain amount of the resin with just a few drops of this hardener. This stuff dries fairly fast or sets up fairly fast, usually about 15 or 20 minutes. This is not the stuff you want to use. If you use this slow drying stuff, you'll get a glass finish across here. It'll be beautifully smooth. Now I'm going to mix up enough of that just to put a very thin coating over the entire nose cone, again being careful not to get any of it down on this sleeve section down here. And then I'm going to hang it overnight and let it drip off of the bottom of it with a tissue underneath it to catch all the drips. And then tomorrow morning, that'll be all done.